It's truly something wild in this town where, yes, everything is politicized, but you get the sense of just how that red line from the very top to the White House has extended across the entire government, every agency. And you almost get the sense that, no stone is being unturned.
Hello, good to see you guys.
Hi,
Hello.
Sumi. Hi, Katrina.
I know this is the president's path, but I think this week we might need to talk about the president's power because that muscle has been flexed, metaphorically speaking, and also literally, I guess, with the War Secretary Pete Hegseth calling for fit, not fat generals in that address that we saw. And I suppose the big thing that's occupying this town this week really is the shutdown. A lot of people have no job to go to or are going to work, but are not being paid for it with that failure to agree funding for the government on the Hill this week. The book is open on how long anyone thinks this shutdown is going to last. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I mean, I think you sort of hit the nail on the head with this being about presidential power, right? This is Trump expanding his powers in how he can reshape the federal workforce through Congress and Republican control of Congress. He's really flexed his muscle. He's empowered his budget chief, Russ Vought, who famously has said he's wanted to shrink the federal workforce. And we're seeing that sort of play out at this point as negotiations or lack thereof with Democrats are playing out as the government remains shut down.
Yeah, and unsurprising, of course, that you're seeing this battle over messaging. Who's responsible for the shutdown? Of course, the Democrats say it's the Republicans and vice versa. But I think what I've seen from Democrats is they believe this is not just about making sure that they get their priorities on any sort of funding bill that they agree to. So, they've talked about making sure that tax subsidies for healthcare are continued, making sure that the Medicaid cuts that were part of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act rolled back. But they also see this as perhaps the only way to kind of put their foot down in the face of that power that you have both described. And it was interesting to hear Chuck Schumer do this interview with the New York Times where he said it was described kind of as the doorway into the rest of what the Democrats want to push back on in the many ways that we've seen this president yield his power.
I think as well we have to say that this shutdown was kind of well signposted, wasn't it? I mean, the Democrats have gone along and sort of bailed out the Republicans many times over the last year. I mean, I don't know how many times we've done programs saying we're burning the midnight oil on Capitol Hill. We're nearly there. Is a shutdown avoided? And Chuck Schumer said, this time we're not going to help you out. We're not going to kind of come riding in and say we'll help fund you for another month or two till you get your act together. And it's been really interesting the messaging, I think, around all of this. That Democrats saying time and again, well, look, Republicans, you have the House, you have the Senate, you have the White House. If you can't find a way to fund the government, then that's on you. But the Republican Party, and very much led from the top on this, are labeling this as the Democratic shutdown, the Schumer shutdown. I mean, I can't remember a time where we've seen shutdowns or things like this where government websites are actually saying this is a democratic shutdown, this is a radical left shutdown, and the messages that are going to federal workers are so politicized like that as well.
I think it's always politicized, right? But you're right in that the ideology piece here seems to be more pervasive. As you said, some of these messages on federal websites, which could be in violation of the Hatch Act, this administration certainly doesn't seem to care about that. But also some different pressure points, right? We have federal workers who have been furloughed. And typically in the past, they would come back and the government would back pay them. But the administration has indicated that they want to use this as an opportunity, to borrow famous words from Rahm Emanuel, who was a Democrat and chief of staff to Barack Obama, never waste a crisis. The Republicans have decided they want to use this to try and further shrink the workforce. So people who are on furlough may not actually come back at all if this administration deems them unessential. So it does seem to be a different type of shutdown in that the administration is following through on some of the threats they've made to try and pressure Democrats to come to the table.
And of course, both sides were well aware of what some of the risks might be in barreling towards a shutdown, and here we are. And I think the Democrats were well aware that those cuts that you're talking about would be within Donald Trump's power if there were to be a shutdown. But their message, at least in the interviews that we've been doing in our programs, has been, look, Senator Schumer, the minority leader, went along with Republicans in March, got a lot of flack for that, as we all know, in the hopes that that would perhaps create more grounds for compromise with the president, with the White House, with Republican colleagues in Congress. And they say that simply hasn't happened, that that has just led to Donald Trump, in their words, usurping more power towards himself and taking some of that power out of the hands of Congress. But it just really, and coming back to the messages on the websites, and a friend of mine who's a federal worker was giving me a peek at one of the emails that this person had received talking about the shutdown. And this friend said, I have never, in all my years working as a federal worker, received an email that had the word Democrats in it. It's truly something wild in this town where, yes, everything is politicized, but you get the sense of just how that red line from the very top to the White House has extended across the entire government, every agency. And you almost get the sense that, no stone is being unturned in terms of the administration's efforts to make sure that all federal agencies and workers, as to the extent that they can, are following along with the president's agenda and wishes.
I think that's as well when you talk to people and they think that this shutdown could last quite some time because, Courtney, you're saying, Rahm Emanuel, never waste a good crisis. I mean, that's an expression in the business world. Never waste a recession, never waste a crisis. And I think there's so many people in this administration who come from a business background that that's kind of where their thinking is at on this because I don't think people ever thought that a shutdown would lead to the permanent laying off of potentially tens of thousands of people, which is what we're hearing from the administration. And we're heading into the Christmas, the holiday season, and people are genuinely very nervous that this could last a few weeks, a month or more, and then they'll have no job at the end of it. So you're incurring debt that whole time that you mightn't be able to get out of it. And they just feel very unsure about that, which I think is leading to, I mean, there already has been, I suppose, an unpleasant atmosphere in this town for a while. And I feel that that ground is even more shaky in these last few days.
And I think it's important to point out, which we've sort of alluded to, but this is coinciding with uh, the departure of federal workers who took a buyout as part of the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, buyouts earlier this year, right? So we're going to see a lot of federal employees who took that buyout and receive their last paycheck. So this is the largest single year exodus of federal employees, US employees, in almost 80 years. 100, more than 150,000 employees are going to come off the payrolls this week, along with, this prolonged government shutdown. And, just the implications of that, once they find a way out of this, what does that look like on the other side? A lot of agencies, as you guys said, you've interviewed federal employees, are losing that. They're having that sort of brain drain. We're going to see USDA is losing 15,000 people through the resignation program. The FDA is losing 3,500, and the CDC is losing 2,400. I mean, that is a lot of institutional knowledge that will just disappear. And what that looks like on the other side, people still are pretty uneasy about it.
Yeah, and for some of our listeners who are not kind of familiar with where federal workers are in the U.S., you might have this sense of this nameless, faceless bureaucrat in D.C. or perhaps even in Virginia and Maryland coming in to Washington to their jobs. I mean, actually, federal workers are spread out right around the country. If you talk about the CDC, their headquarters are in Atlanta. And I know, Katrina, you had been looking at a statistic on this as well, on just how many federal workers are in the DMV area. And you do wonder if the fact that federal workers across the country are being impacted by accepting the buyouts, but also now these massive layoffs, whether that will have any sort of impact on President Trump and how he and the Republican Party see shutdown going forward.
Yeah, I was talking to one of the union leaders here who said the statistic is that 15% of federal workers are in the DMV area, DC, Maryland, and Virginia. So that means a huge number are spread right across the country, but I guess they're not in the same sort of concentration as here. And he was also making the point that, most of them are actually quite low paid workers. Like the average starting salary is more in the sort of $30,000, $40,000 area. They're not sort of big fat cats and fancy offices driving fancy cars. They're people who, do struggle to make ends meet, will struggle now without this paycheck, live paycheck to paycheck. And I think, Courtney, it was interesting you mentioned earlier Russ Vought. He is the one driving this laying off of federal workers. He has long held, as you said, Courtney, a view that the workforce is too large. He is so closely entwined with the Project 2025, one of the architects of it, something that President Trump denied any knowledge of or attachment to on the campaign trail. I mean, it was really controversial last year. And how many times did we hear him say, oh, that's got nothing to do with me. I don't even know what that is. I've never read that document. And then he posts on Truth Social this week to say, I have a meeting with Russ Vought, he of Project 2025 fame, acknowledging it and then acknowledging someone who's a close sort of confidant and advisor and now teammate of his is behind all of this. And it's just really curious to see how kind of that change of thought from President Trump. I mean, I guess we see it in many other arenas as well, don't we? But he says in this post, he recommends to be cut many of these Democrat agencies. So going back to that political language or not, whether or not those cuts will be temporary or permanent, I can't believe the radical left Democrats gave me this unprecedented opportunity. They are not stupid people. So maybe this is their way of wanting to quietly and quickly, in capitals, make America great again. So everything is just being turned into a battle. And now he always seems to call the Democrats the radical left Democrats as well, even though, I mean, how many times have we been speaking over the last few weeks about the need for a toning down of political rhetoric? It would seem like we're not really seeing that at this point.
I mean, it is really interesting to see where the Democrats are on this. Obviously, Jeffries and Schumer, the two Democratic leaders, are doubling down, and we're already seeing their home state suffer some of the repercussions, right? We heard from Russ Vought yesterday that he's going to cancel 18 billion. Do I have that number right? 18 billion in infrastructure projects involving New York, which is their home state. And
Big
he intends.
subway expansion, isn't it? I mean, it's and a tunnel as well. Like it's something that will impact the people of New York.
Yeah, yeah. And so the question, I guess, is, whether the rest of the party is in line with sticking firm. There are Republicans on the Hill who believe they can peel off some of the Democrats in the Senate. It's a big gamble for them at a moment where they're deeply unpopular, where they don't entirely have a unifying message or leader, which we've talked about, at length in probably every episode. Um, but it's a big risk for them, and they are, standing firm on this idea about healthcare subsidies being on the table to pass a funding bill. But the question is, will they be there next week? And if everybody's going to stick to, the message that Schumer and Jeffries are pushing at this point.
Yeah, and you start to wonder whether some Democrats will become uneasy about the prospect of a longer shutdown and the impact on their own political fortunes. If people will see it as a Democrat shutdown or Schumer shutdown, as you said. But I wanted to come back to a point you made, Katrina, about dialing down the rhetoric, and it just made me I really sat up in my seat this week when listening to President Trump speak at this gathering of generals, this hastily kind of planned gathering of generals in Virginia that the defense secretary called. I mean, generals literally from around the world flying into Virginia, leaving their posts for this meeting with
War secretary now, as he is.
sorry,
seeming.
yes, war secretary. Excuse me. I still haven't, kind of gotten that into my mind yet. But when President Trump spoke, he was speaking to a silent room of generals who were listening attentively, and he said, this is the war within, the enemy within, and he talked about using American cities as training grounds for the military. And, in all of the language that we've heard about the need to tone down the rhetoric, I kind of really was surprised in a way to hear that. And you wonder what the generals made of that. And, we should say this comes, of course, we've talked on this pod in the past about the National Guard deployments in Washington and in Chicago, the argument over the governor there, J.B. Pritzker, trying to stop the president for sending National Guard in there. Now, Portland will be the next city from what we understand. But it really kind of, it was an extraordinary meeting in so many ways. And that includes what the defense secretary had to say.
Yeah, what was interesting to me about the defense secretary, Pete Hegseth's remarks versus Trump's remarks was Hegseth really focused on reinstating a warrior ethos, right? That's his big talking point. He wants a more masculine, male-oriented military. And that is a military that is designed for combat. That is a military that is designed for war abroad. That is not a military that is designed to police American cities and US streets. And so I thought in some ways, Trump and Hegseth's comments were at conflict with one another because Trump is talking about, as you said, these using these cities as training grounds, sending in troops to help police cities, while Hegseth is talking about, a more aggressive, a more physically imposing military. And all that does is just set up tension points and potential conflict with civil leaders if we're going to see this government send in more troops into some of these cities where they're claiming that there's violence and crime, but it might not necessarily amount to what they're talking about.
I think President Trump was aware of that kind of contradiction a little bit because he made a remark in the middle of the speech, which was very long. I mean, it was about an hour, maybe even a bit more. But he made some remark like, oh, the lethality that Pete Hegseth has been outlining there and the war on warriors that has been thus far. I mean, Pete Hegseth even wrote a book about that. So he kind of has a blueprint that he's delivering on. But the president said, but of course, I'm the president of peace and I'm going to make it so that you don't actually need to go into these arenas. But should we need to, we will be, the biggest, the best, the brightest, the strongest, the most lethal, etc., etc. But speaking to a few people in the military who are active and also retired, they came away from that meeting kind of bamboozled in a way. Like they felt a lot of it was a waste of time. It cost a huge amount of money to bring all those high ranking people from all around the world, taking them out of those zones where they are to come to this in Virginia. Then they listened to all this stuff that in a way they already knew, right? Because, I mean, we've heard Pete Hegseth go on about how he wants this perfect male sort of standard in the military, removing all the equality programs, making it harder for people to get promoted and so on. They've heard all that before. I suppose the new part from what he said was around, you know, things that were banned in the past or were called bullying in the past or hazing in the past. We're going to get rid of that. We've been too soft. We've been too woke. So in a way, all of that they slightly were expecting, but what they weren't expecting was the bit from the president that you've mentioned there. And the people I've been speaking to came away from it going, okay, how do we square this circle? Because actually we all really believe in the oath that we take, swearing loyalty to the Constitution and to the country. And part of that is we don't use ourselves on ourselves, kind of thing. You know, we are for the defense of our nation, not for a situation where we're coming up against our fellow citizens. And, you know, Pete Hegseth sort of said one of his final lines was, well, if you don't like it, you can leave. And it was said to me that, well, a lot of people might actually leave now because they feel, what if they're ordered and they have to respect the chain of command into cities to do things that, you know, they don't feel they should be doing? So it's a big question mark. It's a big talking point this week, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And if we talk about the president's power, the question of trying to extend that over the military is so critical. And interestingly, it's one of those questions I get asked sometimes with European colleagues where they say, where does the U.S. military stand vis-a-vis Donald Trump? Of course, we don't have any reliable, good studies or polls done at the moment with active duty military. So we don't necessarily have the best sense. But the president is their commander in chief on the one hand, but they do take their oath to the Constitution. And it's so important to keep in mind that, yes, presidents have used the military in certain crises in the past. If you think about the Civil Rights Act in 1965 and President Lyndon B. Johnson using the military to protect Black students at the time. I mean, there are examples of this, but the difference here, and this is according to experts we've been speaking to on our programs, is that there isn't that crisis that warrants these types of deployments. And you do wonder, and I don't know about you guys, but walking around DC at the moment, I've kind of gotten used to the sight of National Guard troops that, I'm not surprised anymore when I see them on the tracks at my subway station. If that becomes more and more normalized, what does that mean for going forward? What more power does that give the president? Emergency powers over, for example, next year's election. What is the impact on the U.S. democracy? I mean, these are really, really critical questions we just don't have the answer to yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important question that a lot of people are keeping their eyes on in terms of how this plays out next year with, looking ahead to elections. I will say, though, that what seems to be the case with a lot of these cities, the check that is remaining on the president has been the courts, right? We saw a federal judge rule his decision to send federal troops into Los Angeles was violated the Posse Comitatus Act. That was illegal. That applied obviously just to Los Angeles, but we know that
I suppose we should just say that Posse Comitatus Act is one that bars federal troops going into domestic situations without congressional approval, which there wasn't in the case of Los Angeles.
yes, thank you, Katrina. But also Oregon is going to sue the administration. And so one thing I do want to point out is the administration has also really relied on appealing a lot of these rulings, hoping that some of them make their way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court is due to begin their next term on October 6th. So we will see, so far, they have really just weighed in on whether the president's controversial policies can continue while they're being litigated. But now, in this term, we should expect to see them actually issue some rulings around some of those controversial policies, like tariffs, like ending birthright citizenship, and his ability to fire the heads of independent agencies.
How does the shutdown impact the federal workers in the Supreme Court?
That's a good question.
Yeah, great question. Because we've already heard that at lower level courts, they won't be hearing any civil cases. They're only going to hear criminal cases during the shutdown. So, what I'm curious about, and I haven't been able to get an answer to this yet, because as you say, Courtney, they're out of session right now, is, how much of the Supreme Court operation is deemed an essential worker where they'll all have to come in without pay, and how many people aren't. So, the lower level clerks who are cross-checking case law and all of that, does it slow down the Supreme Court actions, and what impact that has on the administration's policy move forward? So I shall go and do some more deep research and hopefully have an answer on that one for next week for all of us.
Yeah, that's maybe something we can answer next week. And I guess the following the Supreme Court is going to be a really fascinating one, as you said, Courtney, in the coming weeks as well. So certainly something we'll look at in one of the upcoming episodes.
Lots to talk about, as always.
As always,
Okay, bye, gals.
See you next time.
Bye. If you enjoyed this episode of The President's Path, then like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We would love to hear from you. So please leave us a comment below or email us at path@bbc.co.uk.